there are so many different crankbaits on the market. You have crankbaits that dive literally less than a foot of water, and you have crankbaits that dive all the way down to 25 foot of water. Another great thing about a crankbait is that it really can mimic a lot of different bait fish and little critters that bass love to eat in the water. So you can really mimic a shad very well. You can make it look like a bluegill, and you can also make it look like a crawfish, and those are three of the main forage species that a lot of bass are going to eat. Crankbaits also work well in a variety of different situations and watercolors. You can catch bass on crankbaits in really clear water, in stained water, and even really muddy water. So in this video, we're going to talk about everything that is involved with fishing a crankbait so that this can be the last crankbait video you will watch. We're going to talk about 4 big mistakes that a lot of guys make with the crankbait. Then we're going to talk about exactly how you go about tuning a crankbait to make sure that it is running properly. Then we're going to talk about how to fight a fish that's hooked on a crankbait so that you can land more of them. Then we're going to go in depth about everything involved with shallow water cranking, which is more specifically all about square bills. After shallow water fishing, we're going to talk about deep water crankbait fishing. And then at the very end of this video, I'm going to cover my very favorite crankbait. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. Right now at Sportsman's Outfitters, there is a lot of deals and sales going on until January 10th. So you can still pick up a lot of your favorite lures, tackle, even hunting gear at a big discount. So if you guys would like to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, click those links down below in the description. So the first mistake that a lot of anglers make with a crankbait is they fish it the exact same way, no matter the cover options that they are fishing it around. So maybe they go to one lake and there's a lot of grass, they're fishing it the same way. They go to another lake, there's a lot of wood, and they just fish it the exact same way. They kind of get stuck in a rut of fishing a crankbait the exact same way. And if you think about it, we really have 3 different cover options that we like to fish crankbaits around. One is hard bottom. So a hard bottom could be rock, it could be a shell bed, it could be a clay bottom. Another form of cover is wood. And the last form of cover is grass. So in those situations, you kind of have to fish a crankbait a little bit differently. So let's go over quickly how to fish a crankbait in each of those situations. So the first situation is hard bottom. If you're fishing it around rock bottom, clay bottoms, shell beds, we know as crankbait fishermen that we like to get that bait to hit into the bottom, to hit into the hard bottom. But the thing that will help you to get a few more fish to bite is to not have that bait absolutely digging into the bottom extremely hard. Maybe you're fishing a hump that has rock on top, it's 10 foot on top. So you think, oh, I'm gonna fish a crankbait that dives a 15 foot, that way I can hit that crankbait across the bottom. Now, while that might be the right crankbait, the important thing is you don't wanna be absolutely plowing the bottom. What's really best and what's really gonna help you to get a few more bites is really if you kind of just graze the bottom. What I really like to do is hit the bottom, let that crankbait kind of ride up, hit the bottom, let it kind of ride up, hit the bottom. So I'm burying the retrieve. What I like to do a lot is sweep the rod when I'm fishing hard bottom. It actually helps the bass to get that bait a little bit better. If you think about it, if a crankbait is absolutely digging on the bottom, they have to come from above and pin it against the bottom. And if they're hitting the top of a crankbait, they're not gonna get the hooks that well. But if it hits off of a rock and kind of pauses and pops up and then they hit it, they're gonna get that bait a lot better. Now, when it comes to fishing it around wood, what I really like to do with wood is feather my crankbait. I really like to throw it into the wood cover. I said this in a recent video, but if you're kind of afraid to get a crankbait into a laydown or into heavy cover, you're probably not gonna get as many bites as if you're really willing to put it up there and put it where the fish are. But in that situation, you don't always wanna just reel that crankbait really fast. So if I'm bringing it over a deep brush pile, I'm really gonna kind of feather that crankbait through, which means I'm not always going with a lot of speed in this situation. I'm really kind of feeling out exactly what my crankbait is doing while it's in that wood. If it comes up to a branch, I'm gonna slow that crankbait down a little bit, allow it to pop over that branch without getting hung. So when it comes to fishing a crankbait in grass, speed is really your friend. I like to fish a crankbait when I'm fishing around grass pretty fast. A lot of times that speed is gonna be what causes a reaction strike from a fish. Now, there are certain times of the year, maybe when that water is really cold, where I don't always always use a lot of speed. The other thing that I am purposefully doing when I'm fishing a crankbait in grass is I'm getting that bait hung up in the grass and trying to rip it and pop it free. No matter if that grass is in 15 foot of water or if it's in 4 or 5 foot of water, I want to tick the top of that grass, let it get hung, snatch it out, and that's when you're going to cause a reaction strike from a bass. Mistake number 2 when it comes to fishing a crankbait, never just cast out a crankbait and reel it straight back in, okay? That is rarely going to get the number of bites as if you vary the retrieve. Now, I believe that this is true for just about every lure that you fish. Years ago, when I was fishing on Lake Chickamauga, a guy pulled up next to me on a ledge and he was throwing a crankbait and it looked like he was constantly setting the hook with the crankbait. He was literally reeling it as fast as he could, sweeping the rod and pausing it, reeling it as fast as he could, sweeping the rod and pausing it. That really aggressive style of fishing that bait was causing a reaction strike that I wasn't getting by simply pausing it from time to time and slowly sweeping the rod. So never just cast it out and reel it straight in. Try to snap your rod from time, pause it from time, sweep the rod, impart a little bit of action to that crankbait to get that reaction strike. Mistake number 3 when it comes to fishing a crankbait is not realizing how much control you have over the depth of that crankbait. We all see the package and it says that dives from 10 to 12 foot deep, and you think that it's just going to dive 10 to 12 foot deep. This isn't always the case. Now, there's 3 big things that affect the lure depth of your crankbait. One is the line size. If you're fishing a crankbait on 15 or 17 pound fluorocarbon line, that crankbait is not gonna dive as deep as if it is on 10 pound test or 12 pound test. Another thing that affects the depth of that crankbait is simply where you're positioning your rod. If you're cranking a rod and keeping your rod tip high, that crankbait is probably gonna dive about 3 or 4 foot less than if you actually stick that rod down closer to the water. So that can help you sometimes if you're fishing it around grass, you wanna keep it above the grass, keep that rod tip high, or maybe you're really plowing that bottom like we talked about earlier, raise your rod tip so that that crankbait isn't hitting the bottom constantly, but just kind of ticking it across the bottom. Now, the third thing that affects the depth of our crankbait is actually the distance of your cast. The further out that you cast, the deeper that crankbait is going to dive. So maybe you want to get a really little crankbait to dive really deep, then make as far of a cast as you can. Or maybe you don't want a crankbait to get so deep, you can make a lot shorter casts and that crankbait is not going to run to its maximum depth. Mistake number 4 when it comes to fishing a crankbait is not knowing when to fish a crankbait that has a lot of rattles and when you fish a crankbait that is silent. Now, I really like to keep this pretty simple, and this has changed a lot for me over the years. I feel like bass have kind of gotten more conditioned to crankbaits and different sounds that crankbaits make, so I really fish silent crankbaits a lot more than I fish ones with rattles in them. Now, there are 3 different situations that I like to use a crankbait that has rattles in it. Now, the first one is anytime I'm fishing very muddy water. If I'm fishing muddy water, maybe I'm fishing a square bill, I like to use those rattles. I like to have that extra vibration to help that bass hone in on that bait. The other time that I like to use rattles is if I'm fishing around extremely aggressive fish. You don't always know the behavior of a bass, but sometimes you just kind of get into those situations where those fish are absolutely plowing your bait, whatever it is that you're fishing. They just seem aggressive to you in the water. Maybe you're catching a lot of fish. That's when I'll switch over to the rattles. So the third time that I really like to fish crankbaits with rattles is typically during the pre-spawn. So before the fish actually get up on beds, it seems like during that pre-spawn time frame, it really seems like bass just love vibration. They love rattles. So I like to fish baits that have rattles during the pre-spawn. Real quick, since we're kind of talking about equipment with rattles, I just want you guys to know that it's extremely important to change out the hooks on just about every crankbait that you own. The stock hooks from almost every major company out there pretty much are trash. So what I like to do is switch out those hooks. There's 2 different style hooks that I like. I like a Berkley Fusion round bend hook, and then I like the Mustad KVD triple grip hook. If the fish are really hitting a crankbait hard, I typically switch to that KVD hook. If they're not hitting it that hard, then I'm gonna fish that round bend hook. Now, another mistake that a lot of guys may not know, which leads me into the next part of this video, is not knowing how to tune a crankbait. So I'm quickly gonna show you exactly how to tune a crankbait. Anytime you're fishing a crankbait, you can tune a crankbait, and tuning it means that you can make it run straight. If it's running to the side, you can make it run straight. And all you gotta do is this little ring that's on the very top of a crankbait, you're actually just going to bend that one way or the other. So if it's running to the left, you're gonna bend it a hair to the right. If it's running to the right, you're gonna bend it a hair to the left. It's a very easy modification. It's something you can do in the boat. Now, the big thing that I heard, I think Rick Clun say a long time ago, is he said, if you see that ring move, you've probably bent it too much. This is a very micro adjustment that you're going to do. Bend it a little bit, then cast it back into the water and see how it's swimming. And then you keep doing that until it's swimming real nice and straight. And the big reason, like that one's swimming a little bit better, but it's still just a touch off. I'm gonna bend it again, just a hair to the side. We'll see what this cast looks like now. Oh yeah, nice and straight. Now, the reason that you want that crankbait running straight is that if it's running straight, it's going to dive at its maximum depth. It's gonna get there very, very deep. If you're fishing, 12 foot of water and you're fishing a crankbait that runs 12 to 13 or 14 foot deep, if it's running off to the side, it may never hit the bottom. But if it's running straight, it's gonna be hitting the bottom. So very, very key, very, very simple adjustment.
Something a lot of guys don't like about fishing a crankbait is you can lose a lot of fish. So I'm gonna show you real quick what you can do to help you land a lot more fish with a crankbait.
There's one. Oh, barely hooked. God. It's got the one back hook in him. Anytime you're fishing a crankbait and you get a fish with a back hook, you can do exactly what I just did. I actually just did a couple figure eights with this fish, and as you can see now, he's hooked with both hooks. I'm actually gonna swing him. There we go. See that? Okay. Look at that. So that back hook was in there like that, and I did a couple of figure eights and got him to get hooked again under the underside. The back hook actually came out then, so that may have been a lost fish, but that is so key when you're fishing a deep diving crankbait, especially, when you're fighting a fish, anytime you're fishing a crankbait, not just a deep diving crankbait, being able to do a couple of figure eights and try to get another hook in that fish is really, really key. It's something I always try to do if I see him hooked like that. Nice.
Now let's go in depth all about fishing shallow water crankbaits, and more specifically about square bills.
Now, when it comes to the crankbait itself, pretty much every brand out there has their own square bill crankbait, and I like a lot of them. I've tried several. I haven't tried all of them, but I always end up coming back to the KVD 1.5, the 2.5,
and the 1.0. This is the 1.5. This is my all-around go-to crankbait. Anytime I feel like I'm gonna throw a square bill, I'm gonna pick up a 1.5 just like this. I believe this is the exact color and everything that KVD was using when he won the Bassmaster Classic on the Louisiana Delta. And I try to keep my colors simple for the most part. I like a chartreuse black back. I like some sort of shad pattern crankbait like the one that we got here, and then some sort of crawl crankbait. This one is actually a 1.5 that I custom painted, but another crawl pattern is this guy right here. This is actually the 2.5. I'll throw these crawl patterns a lot of times during the spring of the year. Now, later in this video, we're gonna talk about speed cranking, and I like to do that for smallmouth, especially in clear water. And this is a little baby that I use a lot, which is this perch colored 1.5 to do that speed cranking with. For the most part, I like to keep these colors pretty simple: shad patterns, crawl patterns, and chartreuses. I probably pick up the 1.5 most of the time, but for me, I fish a lot of highly pressured bodies of water, and because of that, I'll pick up this little guy, which is a 1.0 a lot as well. A little bit smaller crankbait can get you a lot of bites. This little crankbait is pretty small, but it will catch some big fish, especially in highly pressured bodies of water. I also like to use this when the water is really cold. If that water is kind of in the upper 40s, low 50s, a lot of times I'm gonna pick up this smaller crankbait because it just doesn't put out quite as much vibration, and I think the bass hone in on it a little bit better because it's not too too much for them. You know, the 2.5 is another great bait that I pick up a lot of times, especially when I'm fishing in really muddy water. As you can see, it's a bigger bait. It's probably twice as big as the 1.5. So it's gonna put out a lot of vibration. It's gonna put out a bigger water displacement. And that way it helps those fish in that muddy water kind of track this bait down. Now, the thing that I like about it is it's not too big. There are some really big square bills, like an 8.0. I don't have a ton of experience throwing those big square bills, but I like the 2.5 because I can still catch, you know, keeper size fish as well as obviously bigger fish with it. Now, that is another time that I'm gonna fish a 2.5 is when I'm fishing around bigger fish, bigger average fish. And you know, if you're fishing a Lake Gunnersville or Lake Chickamauga, I might pick up that 2.5 more than the other baits just because it has a bigger presence.
Those are probably my favorite all-around square bills that I use a lot. I also use a little bait like a Berkeley Fritz side, which is kind of like a square bill crankbait. It's a flat-sided crankbait. And I also use some Lucky Craft square bills quite often. And guys, just so you know, I'm gonna link all the tackle and equipment I just talked about down below in the description. A lot of guys like to know about gear when it comes to fishing a square bill. So I'm gonna talk about that first, and then we're gonna talk about when to fish it, where to fish it, and how to fish it. No matter what brand reel that you like, I really like something in that 6-speed range. As for instance, this is a 6.2 to 1 gear ratio. I would kind of consider that like a medium speed reel. Now, this particular reel that I have here is a Bruin ELS reel. Now, there are times where I like to use a faster reel, something like a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio. Typically, that's in the summer, but we will talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the when and where of square bills. You're probably gonna hear a lot of different opinions as far as a rod goes for a square bill crankbait. I have fished with a ton of different rods over the years, rods that were full glass, rods that were graphite, and the composite rods. And I really have kind of honed in on fishing the composite rods because I feel like you kind of have the best of both worlds with that composite rod. Something that I love about glass rods is that they really have a true parabolic bend to them, and it's actually very hard for a bass to get off once you get them hooked, which is one of the big things that people hate about using treble hook lures and crankbaits is that you're gonna lose a lot of fish. Now, the thing about a true glass rod is you typically don't have the best feel with that rod and they tend to be heavy. Now, on the other hand, with graphite, sometimes you actually feel too much. Sometimes you feel that bass hit that bait a little bit too quick in some situations, and therefore you set the hook and the bass don't typically get that bait as well. So I really like a composite rod. Now, this particular rod here is my favorite because it is the lightest composite rod that I have ever fished with. And this is it's an arc rod, it's a Tharp series rod, and it's called the Grinder. As far as the rod length goes, this is a 7-foot rod. I really think 7 foot is just kind of an all-around great rod. You know, you can really precision target cast along the bank, and you can also make really long casts offshore. And I do both of those a lot with a square bill crankbait. Now, the next component of your equipment is the fishing line itself. I always throw fluorocarbon line when I'm fishing a square bill. Now, as far as the line diameter goes, the pound test, I'm usually using like 12 pound to 15 pound. When I change is really dependent on whether I'm trying to keep that lure higher in the water column and the cover that I'm fishing around. If I'm fishing around a lot of wood and heavy cover situations, I'm gonna use that 15 pound line. That way, if I do hook up with a fish, I can kind of horse him out of that cover before he gets too bogged down in it. There are lures on the market where it seems like certain water temperatures or water clarities can work better for that lure than others. And to be honest, with a square bill, I don't think that a square bill kind of falls into a certain water temperature or water clarity. It really depends on how you fish it. Now, the big thing when it comes to fishing a square bill is, you know, I typically don't want water that is very silent. You know, if you pull into a pocket or you're on the main lake and it's really clear water and it's really still outside, there's no wind, there's no chop on the water, that's not optimal conditions for throwing moving baits in general, and definitely not for a square bill. Typically, if I'm fishing a square bill in clearer water, I usually want some sort of chop on the water. I want a little bit of a ripple. I want something to break up the surface. Another thing is shade. You know, sometimes you can catch fish in clear water around shade lines with a square bill. So having shade or having a little bit of a ripple is something that you definitely want. Now, if you're fishing a little bit more off-color water, like you see behind behind me, whether it's stained or whether it's muddy, you sometimes don't need to have a chop on the water or shade. Sometimes the bass are gonna eat that square bill well, even in still conditions, just because that water clarity kind of cuts down on the visibility that the bass have. But as far as water temperatures, I think anything above 50 degrees, whether it's right at 50 and all the way up to, you know, really warm water like 90, 92 degree water, a square bill can work. Now, when it comes to where to fish a square bill, this is kind of the meat of this video. This is gonna be the longer part of this video because there are certain situations that I really like to fish a square bill during certain times of the year, whether it's pre-spawn or post-spawn or summer or fall. There are certain situations where I love fishing a square bill, and I'm actually gonna go through kind of a calendar year and really tell you where I like to throw a square bill. The pre-spawn is probably one of the best times to throw a square bill. This is that time frame before the bass really move up real shallow and get on their beds. Typically the pre-spawn is gonna be when you have water temperatures between about 50 and 60 degrees. Now it seems like during this time of the year, bass tend to like having vibration. You know, this is a time of the year where a chatterbait can be really good. This is a time of the year where a lipless crankbait can be really good. And the same thing is true with a square bill. Now, when it comes to where I like to fish that square bill during the pre-spawn, one of the best things that you can do is actually look at where you think bass are going to spawn, whether that's pockets or maybe that's bays on a natural lake, and actually kind of start working out towards where you think they winter. Now, really any piece of structure and or cover that you run into when you go from kind of those spawning areas out is going to be a great place to throw a square bill. For instance, this could be a creek channel swing bank. A lot of times that last creek channel swing bank before that pocket kind of flattens out can be a kind of a holding place for bass before they go up and spawn in this pre-spawn time frame. Now, if you move out just a little bit further from the spawning pockets, one of my favorite places to throw a square bill is on those secondary points that are leading into that spawning pocket. If you have some stained water and some rock on those secondary points, those bass can kind of hang on those points before they actually move up there to spawn. If you're fishing in natural lake, sometimes bass are going to spawn up on really shallow flats, something in that 3 to 6 foot zone around boulders or rock. Now, in natural lakes, a great place where bass are kind of gonna stage before they go up and spawn is simple grass clumps. This could be milfoil, this could be coontail, this could be hydrilla. Now, a lot of people are gonna see these grass clumps and they're gonna think about a chatterbait, and they're gonna think about a lipless crankbait or even a jerkbait. And those are great options, but something that's really overlooked is fishing that square bill around those grass clumps. A couple of years ago, this is exactly what Brian New did down on Lake Toho in a Bassmaster Open. A lot of guys, including myself, were fishing hydrilla clumps out in front of spawning pockets. A lot of guys were throwing the typical chatterbaits, jerkbaits, and lipless crankbaits, but Brian New threw a square bill. It was something different, and because of that, he caught a lot more fish and a lot bigger fish, and he won himself like $50,000. Now, it's important to know that when you're fishing a crankbait, a square bill crankbait around grass clumps, you don't have to be hitting the bottom. You know, a lot of times when I fish a square bill, I like to be hitting rock bottom, or I like to be deflecting it off wood cover and really digging into the bottom. When you're fishing grass, I do like to hit that bait along the grass, but I don't necessarily like to get it hitting on the bottom. There's actually a man-made lake that I live close to, but part of this lake really kind of sets up more like a natural lake. It's very flat, it's got a lot of pads around it, and one of the things that I love to do is fish a really small crankbait through those pads early in the year, and I catch a lot of bass doing that when other guys are throwing baits like chatterbaits and lipless crankbaits. Now, when it comes to the spawn is typically going to be that water temperature between about 60 and 70 degrees, and typically when you have fish that are spawning, a square bill crankbait is not the best way to catch them. Now, this is not always true. As a matter of fact, if you are fishing around very stained or muddy water, sometimes a square bill can catch fish that are actually spawning, that are on beds. This is actually how we saw Kevin Van Dam win the Bassmaster Classic on the Louisiana Delta. He was targeting stumps on a big flat where bass were spawning, and he was casting a square bill crankbait in there and catching fish that were actually setting up on beds. Now, moving on to the post spawn, this is typically when you have water temperatures around that 70 70 to 80 degree range. Now, something that happens in a lot of lakes in that post-spawn time frame is a shad spawn. The shad are gonna come up and they actually tend to spawn on hard objects, but one of the places that you can typically find a shad spawn happening is on rock and riprap banks. Now, that shad spawn typically only lasts for a couple hours in the morning. So if you wanna take advantage of this, you're gonna have to get up early and you're gonna have to fish in those low light conditions when those shad are really active and up spawning on the bank. Now, there are other lures like spinnerbaits and swim jigs that really can work well during a shad spawn, but a square bill is just, again, it's a bait that some guys don't think to throw, and it can catch a lot of bass during that post-spawn time of the year. Now, when you get into the summer months, what I have found is that a lot of guys tend to put a square bill down. They stop throwing it, maybe they start throwing deeper lures or topwater lures, and they put that square bill down. And I'm telling you what, that is a mistake. One of my absolute favorite ways to catch bass during the summer is by speed cranking a square bill. Now, typically when I am doing this, I am fishing around grass and clear water. If you have those situations, and that can happen in a pond, a natural lake, or on a reservoir, speed cranking is an overlooked way to catch a lot of bass. Now, the big thing here, like I talked about, you typically want a little bit of a chop on the water. You want something to kind of break it up. Maybe it's a cloudy day, a little bit of a chop. You want something to break up that water. You don't want to do this in still conditions. Now, a big thing here is your reel. This is typically when I go from that 6.2 to 1 up to that 7.1 to 1 gear ratio, because I am literally going to be cranking a square bill just about as fast as you can. I have found this to be extremely effective when fishing, obviously for largemouth, but also for smallmouth. Now, perfect scenario for this pattern is, finding a hump that has, maybe 8 foot of water on top, and it has grass clumps that are growing up maybe within about 3 to 4 foot of the surface. Now, I'm gonna cast that crankbait out there, and I'm literally gonna be ripping this thing as fast as I can, letting it get in the grass, snatching it out, ripping it out, keep on cranking it. In that speed cranking, I'm telling you, it's a very overlooked pattern for catching smallmouth bass and largemouth. Now, if you don't have a clear body of water with grass, another thing that you can do during the summer months is actually go really, really shallow and fish a square bill in dirty water. There's always going to be a population of bass that stay shallow. They're gonna stay up in creeks. They're gonna typically relate to wood cover or rock cover, but they're gonna be really shallow. I mean, even in the hottest part of the year. A lot of times I tend to target those bass with Texas rigs and top waters like a buzzbait, but a square bill is another great option during the middle of summer in the hottest weather way up in some of these creeks. Now, as summer kind of starts to turn into fall, this can be a very tricky time of the year to go out and just catch a bass. A lot of bass have seen lures. You have oxygen in a lake that's being depleted by the turnover. You have a lot of things that are going on. And what I have found is that really up until that water temperature starts to dip back into that 50-degree range, I don't really fish a square bill a ton. Now, I'm not saying that it won't work. I'm just saying that I typically fish other lures until that water starts to creep into the 50s. Once it starts hitting, 57, 56, 55, in that 50-degree range, the square bill becomes a great bait to catch a lot of bass. Now, the thing about the fall is that in the fall, you have bass everywhere. You have bass that are relating to the main body of water that you're fishing. You have bass that have gone up into the creeks. And so when it comes to where I like to fish that square bill, it's everywhere. If I'm fishing a main lake hump and it's only 5 or 6 foot of water on top where I can kind of get that square bill down, that could be a great place to catch bass. Now, if I get up into a creek and there's a creek channel swing bank, or there's a bank that has some big stumps on it, those are other great places to fish a square bill. The big thing here is just fish it everywhere, because what I've seen often when it comes to fishing in that later fall period is that fish will actually kind of suspend in the water columns. For instance, you might be fishing a stump that's in 4 or 5 foot of water and you might fish it with a jig, but those fish actually might be off the bottom a couple of feet relating to bait fish that are in that area. So fishing a square bill a little bit higher in the water column during the fall can be a deadly way to catch a lot of bass. Now, when it comes to how to fish a square bill, probably the biggest thing to know is deflection. deflecting that square bill off of cover, whether it's grass, whether it's a log, whether it's rock, is probably what's gonna get you more bites than just about anything else. If I hit that bait up against a stump and it kicks out, bam, that causes a reaction strike, and that's when the bass gets it. Or if I get it into a grass clump and rip that bait out, bam, that's when that bass typically gets that bait. Now, most of the time, if you can deflect your square bill off of cover of some sort, you're going to catch fish on a bait. But something that kind of helps me, I think, to get a couple of more bites is anytime I'm actually fishing a square bill, something that I really like to do is actually kind of sweep the rod tip. If I'm fishing it around a lay down, or if I'm fishing it down a riprap bank, I really like to kind of sweep that rod and just let that bait kind of hit off rocks and stop and pause and shoot back and just kind of keep it doing a lot of different things. Anytime you can pause that bait, stop it, make it deflect, those are all triggers for a bass that's going to help you to catch more bass on a square bill.
Fishing a square bill is one of my favorite ways to catch them, but one of the best big bass producers all year long is fishing a deep diving crankbait. So let's now go in depth on deep diving crankbaits.
There he is. Big one. Creeped it right over that brush pile and he hit it hard. I don't know, he's acting big. Is he big? Oh gosh, yeah, big one. Woo! Come on, baby. Yeah. Come here, baby. Oh. God. Oh. Oh, look at that big old tub. Look at that big old tub. I got him like a taco. I got him like a taco. Woo, baby. That is a big. Gosh, he's got that front hook. There we go, baby. Deep cranking is by far one of the best ways to catch big bass during the summer, and today we're going to talk all about that, so stay tuned. It's going to be a good one. Woo!
One thing that I've noticed about deep diving crankbaits, and something that I've mentioned on this channel before, is it is not as easy to catch fish on a deep diving crankbait like it used to be. I think, you know, really when Kevin Van Dam started winning a ton of tournaments on a deep diving crankbait, a lot of guys started picking it up and a lot of guys started catching fish on it. But I just feel like bass in general has just kind of gotten conditioned to a deep diving crankbait, whether it's the rattle, the action, I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't seem as easy of a bait to go out there and catch fish. Now, like I talked about earlier, if you can get on this bite, I think it's the winning bite. I think this is what you can do to catch some of the biggest fish in your lake, which is why I want to talk about it. Now, today I have been out here fishing a Strike King 5XD. This is probably one of my favorite deep diving crankbaits, and the reason being is that it can dive upwards of 15 foot deep, and it has a little bit of a smaller profile to it. So whether you fish for really big fish or you live in, you know, an area like I do where there's some smaller average fish here in Ohio, I can still get a lot of bites with a Strike King 5XD. This is also one of my absolute favorite baits to use for fishing for smallmouth. I have caught a ton of smallmouth using a Strike King 5XD. When it comes to the retrieve with a deep diving crankbait, there are three main retrieves that I do. Now, the first thing that's really important to know about a deep diving crankbait is you want to make an extremely far cast. The further out that cast you can make, the deeper that bait is going to dive. So anytime I'm fishing the bait, I'm gonna really wing that bait out there. The first retrieve is going to be just a speed crank, where I'm really just bringing this across the bottom. I usually put the butt kind of right into my, oh God, one just thumped me right there. I usually put the butt of the rod right into kind of my rib area, and I'm literally just speed cranking this. I am making this bait just fly down there. There are so many days when I've been out there on the water and I'm deep cranking, or actually any cranking, and speed kills. If I can really bring that bait really fast, that is when I get those bites. Now, the next retrieve is something that I use specifically for brush pile fishing. And this is actually how I caught that fish earlier today. And when I'm fishing in a brush pile, you don't want to use speed a lot of times, because if you use speed, you're going to get that bait hung up. Now, I'm not saying you're not going to get it hung up fishing this other way, but you get it hung up a lot more fishing it extremely fast. Now, when I'm fishing that brush pile, again, I'm going to make that long cast out there. I'm gonna get that bait down to the depth, And once I start approaching that brush pile, a lot of times you're going to feel it with your rod because that line will sit on top of the brush pile as you're bringing it in. So you're gonna start to feel a lot of pressure. And so when you start to feel a lot pressure, that's when I start to do a slow sweeping retrieve, where I'm really just gonna slowly sweep that bait across the brush pile. And if I go slow like this, I can literally feel that bait ticking over each of the limbs. And slow with a deep diving crankbait, you're going to get through some nasty brush. You will actually be pretty shocked at how much brush down there you could get through with that deep diving crankbait. Now those two retrieves I probably use the most. This next retrieve is something that is really unique, and it's something that I actually learned by seeing another guy fish. Years ago, I was fishing a tournament down on Lake Chickamauga, and I could only get bit on a deep diving crankbait if they were really ripping the current through the lake. Once that current stopped, I could not catch a fish on a deep diving crankbait. And I remember specifically, I was fishing the last day, the championship day of this tournament, and I pulled up onto a little bar and I was dragging a big worm in a drop shot through this area. And a guy pulled up next to me and he was fishing a deep diving crankbait. And I saw him make a long bomb cast out there, and I'm just interested because I'm like, I haven't been able to get bit on a deep diving crankbait. And when I looked over at him, this guy looked like he was constantly setting the hook. Literally, his retrieve looked like he was constantly setting the hook. And I'm gonna show it to you right now. So he was reeling that bait down to depth, and then all of a sudden, this is what he was doing. He was going and reeling it literally all the way back to the boat, like this. All the way back to the boat. And I tell you what, this guy absolutely cracked the bass, and I could not believe it because there was no current running through the lake at this point, and this guy was absolutely cracking them on a deep diving crankbait. And then interestingly enough, during the 2022 Bassmaster Elite at Lake Pickwick, there was an Elite Series guy that was fishing this exact same way. So this is something that a lot of guys aren't doing, and what it does is it just causes a violent reaction strike from the bass. When you sweep that rod where you're almost setting the hook, that crankbait is gonna shoot forward and then it's gonna pause for a hair second. And a lot of times when it pauses, that is when they crack it. So if you are fishing around a lot of fishing pressure, a lot of other guys that are fishing deep diving crankbaits are a little bit tougher conditions, that is a way to get a bass to react to the bait when they might not react otherwise. For a deep diving crankbait, the rod, reel, line that you use are extremely important. Now the reel, you want a little bit slower gear ratio. I would say anything around that 6.2 to 6.4 to 1 gear ratio. And sometimes if you are throwing really deep diving crankbaits, I even step it down to a 5.3 to 1 gear ratio. That really allows you to fish that bait all day without it just being very stressful on your hand. Now the rod is actually probably the most important part of this entire system. You want a longer rod, something that is at least 7 foot 6 inches in length. This is actually a 7 foot 11 inch rod. And you also want a moderate action. You want a rod that has more of a parabolic bend. And I actually fish pretty much a parabolic bending rod with all my treble hooked lures, but especially with that deep diving crankbait. Now that length, that 7 foot 11, 7 foot 6 inch is really going to help you to make a long bomb cast. And that is really important if you want to get that bait down to its maximum running depth. Now when it comes to the line, I like 12-pound fluorocarbon line. There are a few situations where I will actually up the line to something like a 15 or a 14-pound fluorocarbon. And usually that's when I'm fishing those really big baits, something like a 10XD that will dive 25 foot deep. I like to fish that big bait with 14 or 15-pound line because a lot of times you will actually break that bait off with 12-pound. You'll go to sling that bait way out there and it has a couple nicks in the line and that bait will just keep going forever. Now the last thing when it comes to deep diving crankbaits that is extremely important to know is when to put that bait down, because like I talked about earlier in this video, they're not always gonna bite that bait. And I've seen certain days where they bite it really, really well and then they just shut off to that bite altogether. I was fishing on Lake Oneida several years ago, catching a lot of smallmouth, and then it seemed like they just stopped biting it. And my buddy, who was also fishing during this tournament, he picked up a drop shot and kept catching smallmouth. I was too stubborn. I kept fishing the crankbait and I didn't catch any more fish. So there's a really specific time when you just shouldn't pick up that bait. And the first thing that I'm gonna tell you, if you're catching them really good on that bait and all of a sudden you start losing a couple of fish, or it seems like they stop getting hooked so well, that is usually a sign that things are kind of slowing down with the crankbait. And that's usually a sign when you should start to pick something else up.
Now, there are a lot of really unique crankbaits out there on the market, but this really unique crankbait right here has become my absolute favorite. So let's talk about that now. I must say, I was dead wrong about this bait right here, the Hybrid Hunter by Strike King. This is actually a very unique lure, and today I actually just came out here to just kind of test this bait out. I wasn't really anticipating on catching fish, and I did, and now I want to talk to you a little bit more about this bait. If you guys haven't heard how this crankbait kind of came to fruition, I'm going to leave a link for a video down below by Todd Castledine, and he was really the guy behind the Hybrid Hunter. He has a really cool story, and I would tell you right now, but I'm just going to leave a link down below if you want to learn more about this bait. Now, this crankbait isn't extremely new. It's kind of been on the market for I think about a year now, but it's a bait that I was really excited for because one of the biggest characteristics that you hear a lot about this crankbait is that it comes through grass extremely well. And something that I love to fish is offshore grass like hydrilla and milfoil and coontail. And I love to throw moving baits. A lot of times I'm throwing chatterbaits around there, but you get in so many situations where you get around other guys and everybody is throwing the exact same thing. They're throwing chatterbaits, they're throwing lipless crankbaits. So having another lure like a crankbait, something that I can reel through that grass, it is very appealing to me, and I have found that this crankbait does just that. I have used this in places where I am really impressed at how well it comes through that grass and it'll come through it clean. Now, one thing that I was definitely wrong about is that I thought that this bait, because of the way that this lip is shaped, I thought it wouldn't come through wood cover that great. And I'm telling you what, this not only comes through wood cover, but it's probably the best crankbait that I have ever fished around wood cover.
I mean, I don't know if you guys can see, there's a big laydown right there. I mean, I'm throwing this thing just straight up in the laydown, and I mean, it's just coming right through it. I mean, no problem at all. I'm throwing it over. Oh gosh, did you see that? Did you see that? Holy crap, that fish is, oh my gosh, that thing scared the crap out of me. I think I would have caught that fish if I hadn't seen it hit the bait. I literally just, I saw a big flash and felt a little pop and my body just reacted. I just absolutely jerked. Oh my gosh. Tell you one thing I really noticed about this bait is that it hunts in the water really, really well. And what I mean by hunting is, you know, not only is it diving in the water, but it goes side to side. There's a lot of side to side action. And when you have a crankbait that has a lot of side to side action like that, you don't always need to be hitting the bottom to be able to actually catch fish on it. Some crankbaits that don't really have that action, really about the only way you're going to catch fish on it is if it's hitting the bottom. And when it deflects off of something, usually that's when you get bit. But as you can see, that fish I just missed over there, he hit that bait when it was just about to come out of the water. And that's just because this bait will kick from side to side, and when it kicks from side to side like that, it will actually trigger a bass to eating it. Oh, there's a fish. Golly. Oh gosh, it's a big one. Come on, baby, stay on there. Come on, baby. Look at that. We were just freaking talking about it. Come here. Oh, look at that, baby.
There are places today that I have been throwing this bait that honestly I would feel weird about throwing a Texas rig in, thinking that I'm going to get hung. Over about the last hour, I fished around this entire island that is basically nothing but wooden laydowns, and I got hung up just one time with this bait. And even when I got hung up, I literally just popped it once, and because this bait is so buoyant, it kicked back and I was able to get that bait. Now there was one other time that I got snagged on something today.
What in the heck do I got? I got a daggum carp. Don't take my bait, please. Oh, he did take my bait. Dadgummit, you stupid carp.
Now, not only will it come through grass and wood cover, but I spent a good part of the day actually fishing this down riprap banks. And the same thing, it came through the riprap, it came through the rock extremely well. I was really impressed by the way that this bait just came through cover.
Riprap. Old hybrid hunter. Likes the rocks too. Oh. Yes, sir.
The big thing about fishing a bait that comes through cover really nice is it really gives you the confidence to throw it anywhere. And if you're throwing this bait anywhere, you're a lot more likely to catch fish on it, because there are sometimes, you know, even with like a bait like a spinner bait, where I see a little area, maybe it's really branchy, really sticky, and I'm like, man, I don't know if I want to throw this spinner bait in there because it might get hung up. Well, there might be a bass sitting in there. And I was really impressed by this bait because it came through even the nastiest, like those really small sticks. Those are the ones that you get hung on a lot, you know, kind of the end of a branch where it really has small little twigs on the end. That's where you can get hung a lot, and this bait just came through it.
Oh gosh, got him. Golly, dude. This is too much freaking fun. Look how fat that joker is. Oh, look at how fat that guy is. Are you kidding me? Look at that.
Now, another thing is I thought it would be more of a warmer water crankbait because, one, it is really loud. Like, it's got some serious knock in there. And the other thing is that it's got a really big presence. Like, this is kind of a bigger bait, although they do have the smaller size, and I was fishing the smaller size today. It still has kind of a big presence in the water. It has more of a rock to it, and it just displaces a lot of water. And for those reasons, I thought this is kind of be a warmer weather, warmer water type bait. And I am fishing in 52-degree water today. 52-degree clear water, and I was able to catch several bass on this bait. A lot of crankbaits, when you bring them through the water with kind of a round bill, you know, they're gonna kind of go back and forth like this in the water as they kind of dig down. Now this one, it kind of seems to get to a depth, and then once it's at that depth, it actually kind of rocks more than anything in the water. And the reason that I like that rocking action is it actually reminds me of another lure, which is a spy bait. That rocking action tends to really send out a flash of light. It sends out the flash of the side of that bait, which can actually draw fish in from a distance. I've seen this a lot with a spy bait, but with this bait, I can see it doing the exact same thing. Today, I was fishing this on my favorite crankbait rod. It's the Arc Tharp Series grinder rod. It's a 7-foot rod. It's a composite rod, so it has more of that parabolic action, which I really, really like with treble hooks. I was also throwing it on a 6.2-to-1 gear ratio reel. Now, I was actually fishing this on 12-pound line because honestly, I just came out here to kind of test the bait out. I wasn't expecting to catch a lot of fish, especially around wood cover. If I'd known I was going to be fishing this wood, I may step up to 15-pound line just for a little extra abrasion resistance.
If you guys have enjoyed this in-depth approach to fishing a crankbait, I did a very similar video all about fishing a chatterbait, and I'm gonna leave a link for it right here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, you will also enjoy this chatterbait video. Please subscribe, comment, and I'll see you guys in the next video.